great man is reduced to memory. Objects that were kept warm in his pockets just hours before are ownerless. In the day that led to his last moments, Abraham Lincoln suspected nothing. The Civil War was ending. Robert E. Lee had surrendered, and Lincoln was looking forward to the rest of his life.
They started planning the future. They were happy.
But a band of Confederate sympathizers spent those same hours activating a deadly plot.
Then fate steps in and takes it all from them.
History was changed in an instant.
They arrive late to the theater, and the play begins, and then it was the story that everybody knows.
But this story goes inside the tragedy as the clock ticks down the last 24 hours of Lincoln's life. What happened on that fateful day? And what can we learn from the objects that survive? Morning, April 14th, 1865. In just 24 hours, the country will be plunged into unimaginable grief. But the day dawned bright and sunny. The nation was emerging from the bloody sacrifice of civil war. The war hung over Abraham Lincoln's presidency like a cloud. The problem of slavery was threatening to tear the country apart before the ink was even dry on the Constitution. On Lincoln's watch, it happened.
If he succeeded in soldering the Union back, then he would obviously be considered alongside Washington as among the greatest of American presidents. On the other hand, if he failed, he would be the last president of the United States. And there was really nothing in between.
It had been just 5 days before April 14th that the Southern surrender at Appomattox marked the beginning of the end of the war.
There's just this sense of this relief after 4 years of this incredible war. And here's this moment where it's like the clouds are breaking, the sun is coming out.
Lincoln starts the day with a personal account of the end of the war.
To tell Cornelia, everything is excellent this morning.
It's perfect.
He has breakfast with his family, including his son Robert, who's home from the war.
Tell us about your adventure with General Grant.
As an aide to General Ulysses S. Grant, Robert Todd Lincoln was witness to the surrender.
Very ordinary transaction, believe it.
President Lincoln expressed a lot of interest in details about the surrender, General Lee, what he looked like, and expressed, his hope for a happy future.
We should go for a drive this afternoon.
Mary Lincoln talks about their plans to attend the theater that evening.
There were two great theaters in Washington at that time, Ford's Theater and Grover's. All the Lincolns had to do was express an interest in coming, and believe me, the theater people knocked themselves silly getting the tickets to the White House. Because if the president is coming, that brought in extra patrons. You wanted to see the president, even if you didn't want to see the play.
When I was a boy, my mother would make corn.
For a modern president, going to the theater constitutes a security nightmare. But Lincoln lived in a different world.
He has this great thirst for human contact and relationships. And so he works hard at not isolating himself within the world of the White House.
Lincoln was seemingly determined not to be a prisoner of his office, not to live in the bubble. Because even in the 19th century, there was a bubble.
It was the Lincolns' habit to see a play nearly every week. Their patronage was raising the social profile of the theater.
There were many people who disliked the theater. It had a false reality to it, for example. There were extravagance, emotionalism, coarse audiences, late hours, a historic association with prostitution, for example. A lot of these things led kind of the moral element of the country to exclude or boycott actors socially.
The evening's performance stars the British actress and director Laura Keane. Known for her beautiful dancing girls, reviewers warned polite audiences of the hidden mysteries of alabaster bosoms and the finely shaped legs parading Ms. Keane's stage. Keane's comedy, Our American Cousin, was her signature production. But history will remember it for one tragic event.
So how can I help you?
After breakfast, in his White House office, he meets with Nancy Bushrod, a newly freed woman seeking back pay for her Union soldier husband.
Interestingly enough, we do know a little bit about how Lincoln might have reacted to the newly freed people.
I'll do my best.
In the fall of '63, he had issued a proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction. And what he seemed to be saying was that freed people should be educated. They had to become a part of American society. They needed to be treated fairly.
Lincoln promises Mrs. Bushrod she will receive the lost paychecks. At 11 a.m., he leads a cabinet meeting.
It was a good meeting. Everyone said Lincoln seemed lighthearted, that like a burden had been lifted off him by the surrender of the main Confederate Army.
Lincoln made it clear that he wasn't interested in any more bloodletting. He didn't want to be party to hanging Jeff Davis or any other of the ringleaders of the late rebellion.
Enough lives have been sacrificed.
Agreed, Mr. President. Healing must be our primary.
Secretary of War Edwin Stanton has a seat at the cabinet table. Just days before, Lincoln refused to let him resign, pleading he needed Stanton's help through the war's final act. Assistant Secretary of State Frederick Seward is filling in for his injured father. William Seward is bedridden after a carriage accident.
Seward is really Lincoln's closest confidant and advisor. So, in some sense, he's deputy president.
General, I'm delighted.
Fresh from the surrender, General Grant is the celebrity in the room. Lincoln invites him to the theater, but Grant and his wife are leaving town to visit their children.
Very important.
At 3 p.m., Lincoln meets with his vice president, Andrew Johnson.
There probably couldn't be two people more opposite than Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln. Johnson hated Black people in general. He did not believe that Black people had any rights that he had to recognize.
Almost all you need to know about Andrew Johnson is that he didn't call it Reconstruction. He called it restoration. Well, words matter, and sometimes words matter a great deal.
At 4 o'clock, Lincoln set the complicated affairs of the nation aside for a rare outing with his wife.
It was unusual, maybe exceptional, that Lincoln would have asked to join his wife on her carriage ride around the city.
He wanted to go alone, just the two of them, nobody trailing along.
It was a very sort of intimate moment for them. And it comes out of this buoyancy of, the war is over. We finally can look to our future. All of the self-doubt, somehow is relieved.
A lovely day.
Oh, yes. This is going to be nice.
Lost in a moment of bliss, Lincoln was unaware of the nefarious conspiracy organizing to take his life.
We need to talk.
Look like you're feeling quite well. Giddy, in fact.
She talks about how he's in this giddy mood. And in a sense, she's teasing him, Seeing this individual that she knew many years ago in Springfield seems to be emerging. This burden is just lifting off.
I'm happy to be with you today.
Lincoln had a very hard time during the war. Not only the responsibilities, the decisions that led to the deaths of thousands of people, but he also lost his son, Willie, in 1862. That sent Mrs. Lincoln into a spiraling depression.
Willie was just 11 years old when he died.
From what we hear, he was Lincoln's favorite child and the one that was most like Lincoln.
A Smithsonian treasure reveals a physical reminder of the tragedy.
This is Abraham Lincoln's silk top hat. It has this wide band around it. And this is a mourning band that he added to it for his son who died of typhoid fever in the White House. And he keeps this mourning band on the hat throughout much of the rest of his presidency. And I think what he's doing is a very public recognition that he's tying his mourning with the loss of so many others during the Civil War.
For Lincoln, the war took an obvious physical toll.
Look at the photo. The picture's worth 10,000 words. You don't need 10,000 words to see just what a cost had been exacted.
But on this day, they are putting it all behind them.
I consider this day to be truly the end of this war.
They talk about their travel plans, and she says she wants to go to the capitals of Europe, and he wants to go see the gold mines in California and visit the Holy Land. And he says, you know, this is the beginning of a new life for us. We need to put aside our sorrows and think about the future.
It was one of her best memories of him.
And then fate steps in and takes it all from them.
This is Abraham Lincoln's fine gold pocket watch. And it comes with this incredible story.
When Lincoln took his watch to have it cleaned, jewelers left secret engravings inside.
There's a message that says, on this day, Fort Sumter has been attacked. Thank God we have a government. Another watchmaker who signs his name and dates it a couple years later. And then a third individual scratches in the name Jeff Davis.
The Smithsonian only discovered the messages in 2009.
A little frozen moment in time, waiting, you know, almost 150 years until it was revealed.
On April 14, 1865, the watch was counting down the minutes of Lincoln's last day. They planned for the future on an idyllic private carriage ride.
And then they come back and they get ready to go to Ford's Theater. They try to bring a number of people to come with. Most people say no.
It's surprising, I know, to modern people to hear that, because today a presidential invite would almost be a requirement, but apparently not in 1865.
In the end, the Lincolns are accompanied by a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone, a survivor of the Battle of Antietam, and his fiancée, Clara Harris.
They arrive late to the theater.
The play was stopped. They were cheering for him and laughter, and he waved and acknowledged the crowd.
The Lincolns sit close together, her hand on his arm.
Mary, during the play, when they're sitting down there, is flirting with Lincoln. And she turns to him and says, "What will this other couple think of me?"
She won't think anything at all.
On stage, an uncultured American romances an aristocratic Englishwoman. For the Lincolns, it's a private joke, bringing to mind a certain lawyer born in a log cabin who courted the daughter of a wealthy Kentucky businessman.
You are not used to the manners of a good society.
The moment where the play is full of laughter and a big punchline is coming up, and right as the whole theater bursts into laughter.
Turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dollar-jizing old man.
In a blink, it is done. Levity melts into horror. Lincoln's future runs out onto the floor with the blood from his wound. As astonishing as it was horrible, it was just one of several attacks across the city, an intended decapitation strike on the U.S. government. Almost exactly 12 hours before, one fateful moment set it into motion. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the killer arrived at the scene of the crime. The president's murderer wasn't a sniper, soldier, or professional assassin. He was an actor.
John Wilkes Booth was 26 years old when he shot Abraham Lincoln.
Booth was a well-known figure on the American stage, renowned as much for his stage fighting as his handsome face. His father and brother were the most famous actors in America. The Booth family was theater royalty.
On the morning of April 14th, Booth is picking up his mail at Ford's Theater, which he occasionally did. He was a frequent performer there, and the owner of the theater knew him.
The president is coming tonight. Prepare the state box.
In an instant, a nebulous plan to avenge the South snaps into focus.
I don't think Southerners ever really anticipated a loss. And so when the South did lose, there were people who were inconsolable. And of course, Lincoln was at the center of that.
He believed that he had one last chance to save the South, and that was to assassinate Abraham Lincoln.
While Lincoln met with his cabinet, John Wilkes Booth cased the presidential box at Ford's Theater.
And of course, a clock was ticking on the fate of the South. If something was to be done to help the South, it needed to be done immediately. So this was a grand confluence of moment and occasion.
He cannot take away my way of life. I will lose my boarding house.
More than a year earlier, in the summer of 1864, Booth was plotting to kidnap the president.
We trade him for our brothers. We take him.
He thought that the South's chances of winning would be improved if he could capture the president and take him as a hostage to Richmond.
Perhaps Booth's bold plan was an attempt to assuage his guilt for taking refuge in the safety of the theater, while 500,000 Southerners died on the battlefield.
He felt like a coward. He personally said to his mother that, you know, I'm a coward. I play a hero, you know, but I just act one. I'm not a real one. And he sat there watching history be made by other young men his age. It was a torment to him.
But by the time of Lincoln's second inauguration, kidnapping wouldn't have helped the collapsing South. Booth was in the crowd to see Lincoln sworn in on March 4th, 1865. In his speech, the president condemned the evils of slavery.
Booth believed in slavery, and he did not want to see the world change, and that infuriated him.
On the morning of April 14th, Booth realizes he has a perfect chance to strike a last-ditch blow for the Confederacy. Not to kidnap, but to kill.
A probably more rational thinking person would think, okay, killing the president isn't going to change things, but he believed that it would.
At Ford's, he could strike his blow for justice on his own turf.
Booth, after all, was an actor. He had performed at Ford's Theater.
Oh, Marco!
18 months before this day, he came face to face with Lincoln on this very stage.
Death is in thine eyes.
Mr. Lincoln, he looked as though he meant that for you.
It is an agony, unbearable by mortals.
He does look rather sharp at me, doesn't he?
It is a grief that will kill me.
Booth has no intention of sacrificing himself for the president. He plans to escape to the South to bask in his newfound fame. He secures the rental of a fast horse for the evening. The stablemaster has no idea that his horse will never be returned. But Booth is directing a tragedy with more than one antagonist.
We need to talk.
And more than one victim.
This is Abraham Lincoln's office suit. It's also the suit that he was wearing the day of April 14th, before going to Ford's Theater.
After the president's death, an artist borrows the suit to paint a portrait of Lincoln. The White House doorman delivers it.
The doorman makes a point of telling them about the frayed cuffs. And he says, you'll notice that the cuffs on this suit are frayed from Abraham Lincoln writing so many pardons over the course of the war.
Just blocks away, his killer is planning the unforgivable. Booth calls on Confederate veteran Lewis Powell.
Wilkes, we need to talk.
He was 6 feet tall, well-built, a very impressive person of bold purpose. He had fought well and hard during the war. Someone who knew him said in his personal manner he was soft and gentle as a kitten, but at the same time, he would have waded through blood if he had to for his cause.
You get there at 10 p.m.
One of his brothers had been killed during the Civil War. Another brother had been wounded, so he also probably had this sense of vengeance.
Powell is to kill Lincoln's right-hand man, Secretary of State William Seward.
Why take out Seward? Well, perhaps in Booth's mind, he's kind of the brains behind Lincoln. Lincoln is not thought to be that smart by particularly Confederates, but even lots of Northerners do not think of Lincoln as a scholar.
I have a pistol.
An invalid, Seward should be easy pickings, but Booth won't stop there.
John Wilkes Booth did not plan just to kill the president. At a minimum, John Wilkes Booth targeted the president, Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State Seward, and General Ulysses Grant.
Booth is a natural leader who commanded a Baltimore street gang as a boy. As a man, his fame provides a willing cadre of accomplices.
In some ways, there are a number of just sad individuals, bitter, desperate, acting out. Not that different than many of the figures that we know in more recent times that have made assassination attempts of presidents or other world leaders.
The South will crumble if we lose our slaves.
They meet at a boarding house owned by Mary Surratt.
Mary Surratt believed wholeheartedly in the Southern cause. She believed in slavery. She believed in that way of life.
The South is very much interested in retaining this institution that is central to their lives.
The mark of freedom in America was race, and therefore people took a lot of pride in being white.
Mary Surratt knows this collection of men through her son, John Surratt Jr., a Confederate courier who is in Canada on April 14th.
Because it was a boarding house, people were coming and going from there. The conspirators were able to meet and not raise any sort of eyebrows or raise attention. So it was a perfect sort of spy lair.
Booth assigns a second man to help Powell carry out the Seward assassination.
A mousy clerk by the name of Davy Harold, who's to hold the horses, to guard the front door, while Powell goes in to kill Seward.
An avid bird hunter, David Harold knows the Maryland countryside. He offers the promise of a clean getaway. At 2:30 p.m. on the 14th, Booth brings Surratt a pair of field glasses. She promises to deliver them to her tavern 15 miles south of Washington.
And she did her bidding for John Wilkes Booth, and she went back and waited in her house until the assassination occurred.
Booth travels from Surratt's to the Kirkwood House, the home of Vice President Andrew Johnson and conspirator George Atzerodt. Atzerodt is the 19th century equivalent of an auto mechanic. He owns a carriage repair shop, but he also moonlights on the river, bringing rebel spies into Maryland. Atzerodt isn't at home. Booth leaves a note, but not for George. He writes a message to Vice President Johnson.
I don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home?
The note suggests the unthinkable: collusion between the vice president and the assassin. Johnson was unpredictable. He got drunk at his own swearing in.
Those who say,
and got up and made an ass of himself.
and I had my reason for
To the
that.
embarrassment of everyone, including the president.
Come from horrible, humble beginnings. Because
Mary Lincoln believed Johnson and Booth had a connection.
That miserable inebriate Johnson had cognizance of my husband's death. Why was that card of Booth's found in his box? Some acquaintance certainly existed.
that
They may have even known one another well. As the rumor goes, when Johnson was governor of Tennessee, he had a mistress whose sister was simultaneously seeing none other than John Wilkes Booth.
to each and every one
Two
of
sisters, two Southern sympathizers who communicate on the day of the assassination.
them, reunification of the
But Mary Lincoln's suspicions appear to be unfounded. Booth was arranging Johnson's murder. While President and Mrs. Lincoln ride through town, Booth walks the same streets, searching for George Atzerodt. At 4:30 p.m., General Grant and his wife Julia pass Booth in their carriage on their way out of town. Their journey may have saved Grant's life and prevented the assassination of a second U.S. president.
If, as he believed earlier in the day, General Grant had been in the box that evening, I think he might well have killed Grant as well.
Atzerodt, you are a hard man to find.
Booth locates Atzerodt and orders him to kill Johnson as close to 10:15 p.m. as possible.
We killed Johnson.
Booth's plan was to do all of this kind of more or less simultaneously because he was concerned that if, for example, the president was killed at 9 p.m., and then you tried to kill Seward at 10 p.m. and Johnson at 11 p.m., that guards would have been placed.
You said kidnap. You specifically.
But in assigning Atzerodt to kill the vice president, Booth completely misjudged his man. Atzerodt was rather a villainous-looking character, but he wasn't a desperado. He was in for the kidnapping, but not for the murder.
You can do this.
But Booth could be convincing.
You gave your word.
On stage, his brutal fight scenes injured fellow players. His distraught Romeo ripped Juliet's hair out by the roots. His violent Richard III knocked an actor into the orchestra pit. Off stage, he was just as aggressive.
You give your word.
April 14th, 1865, 7 p.m. Inside room 228 at the opulent National Hotel, one of America's most well-known actors is about to become one of America's most well-known villains.
Many I know, the vulgar herd, will blame me for what I'm about to do. But posterity, I am sure, will justify me.
If tonight goes as planned, John Wilkes Booth will be leaving the North behind forever. He'll also abandon his fiancée.
He was involved with Lucy Hale, who was the daughter of the senator from New Hampshire.
Hale, it is so good to see you, my friend.
Just hours before, at the White House, Lincoln met with his assassin's future father-in-law, John P. Hale. Hale is considered the first senator to take a stand against slavery.
It is supremely ironic that Booth, who is essentially a pro-Southern fanatic, would be engaged to the daughter of a high-profile abolitionist senator.
Booth and Lucy also met on the morning of the 14th.
Clearly, he had to keep his sympathies to himself and act in a certain way around her and her father. And clearly they had no idea he was capable of killing the president.
Booth's leather journal, which exists to this day in the collection at Ford's Theater, offers a clue to his relationship with Lucy Hale. Her photograph is just one face in a stack of 4 other women. Just 3 blocks away, President Lincoln is also preparing for the evening out.
As Abraham Lincoln is getting ready to go to Ford's Theater, he's drinking a cup of coffee, and he leaves it behind on the windowsill. This is a coffee cup from the Lincoln service at the White House. When word of his assassination reaches the White House, one of the servants of the White House sees that the coffee cup was left behind and preserves it. It's the last thing that Lincoln drank from before going to Ford's Theater.
At 8 o'clock, Lewis Powell is preparing for his deadly errand. He packs a revolver, a Bowie knife with an 8-inch blade, and perhaps anticipating an escape, his toothbrush. At the same time, George Atzerodt, the conspirator assigned to kill Vice President Johnson, is drinking heavily in anticipation of his grisly task.
I am willing to pour all over you like apple sass over roast pork.
The Lincolns and their guests arrive at Ford's in high spirits.
The crowd applauds the president. They stop the play. They sit down, and the play begins.
It comes to their barking up the wrong tree about the old...
No! I'm delighted! Not at fortune.
About 10 minutes after 10, Booth began to mount the stairs leading up to the second tier of boxes where you would find President Lincoln.
Across town, Atzerodt realizes the time has come. And Powell arrives at Seward's door.
He has a little package, which he says is medicine from Seward's doctor.
Evening, sir. Yes, I have medicine here for Mr. Seward. I'm instructed to give it to him personally.
So there's a little conversation with the servant at the front door.
I'll take it right up to him.
I'll take it up to him. No, I'm supposed to take it to him personally. And finally, Powell just ignores the servant and goes up the stairs.
I'm delighted!
And then there's another conversation at the top of the stairs with Seward's son, Frederick.
Instruction to take it to him.
I'll take it to him.
I'm to take it to him personally.
And Seward's daughter, Fanny, opens the door of Seward's sick room.
Is someone here to see Father?
So now Powell knows exactly where Seward is. He's now found his victim.
Frederick?
Oh! He pulls out his pistol, points it straight at Frederick's head, point blank range, and pulls the trigger.
As Booth makes his way toward the presidential box, he is seen, but no one stops him.
He was well known to everyone, a popular actor, of course. And that let Booth get right behind Lincoln.
At Seward's,
Frederick!
Powell's gun malfunctions.
But Powell clubs Frederick on the head. Frederick falls to the floor. They later find holes in his head large enough you can see his brain.
You are not used to the manners of a good society.
Booth is in position at Ford's.
Booth comes into the box right as the whole theater bursts into laughter.
Powell bursts through the door.
Please, no!
He's basically broken the gun in attacking Frederick, but he has this Bowie knife. It's about that big. And he raises it up, pushing Seward down onto the bed.
Oh, no.
And slashes down at Seward's sort of face and neck.
As the crowd roars with laughter, Booth takes aim.
Stop apologizing, old man trap.
And so that moment where the whole future looked like had finally lifted, the clouds had separated, comes crashing down.
The bullet enters the back of Lincoln's head.
Booth stepped up to him, fired a shot from perhaps 3-4 inches, not right against Lincoln's head, but close, and it hit Lincoln in the back of the head, like a sledgehammer would. This is the Derringer that Booth used on April 14. It's about 6 inches long, weighs about 8 ounces.
A part of the Ford's Theater collection, this instrument of history was Booth's personal weapon.
Booth probably had this weapon for at least 5 or 6 years before the assassination took place. It fires a single bullet, so this is like we say, one and done. Booth dropped the pistol, went to the front of the box intending to escape. Major Rathbone jumped from his seat. He grabbed Booth from behind and pulled him back from the railing. Booth twisted around in the Major's grip, and for the first time the men were face to face. And Rathbone later said he was absolutely horrified by the look on Booth's face. And Booth was stronger than Rathbone was, so he was able to free himself and slash Rathbone with a knife.
Someone help him! President, shot!
Booth leaps from the box to the stage.
Sic semper tyrannis!
And makes his escape. Powell also runs from the scene of his crime. It took only seconds to leave both Seward men barely clinging to life.
He leaves behind a house described, in the words of all who saw it that night, as bathed in blood.
As I stood, my feet slipped in a great pool of blood. Father looked so ghastly, I was sure he was dead.
But Seward opens his eyes, calls for a doctor, and orders Fanny to close the house. At Ford's, 23-year-old surgeon Charles Leal is the first person to gain entry to the box after the shooting.
I'll do everything in my power.
Please, please.
He's been a doctor for only 45 days. Initially, the president appears unwounded. Dr. Charles Taft enters the box the same way Booth left it. Leal discovers the president's dilated pupils, signifying brain damage.
Check his scalp for any bullet wounds.
They find the wound in the back of his skull.
His wound is mortal.
Leal utters the words that would reverberate across the country.
His wound is mortal. It is impossible for him to recover.
In the theater, panic breaks out.
Laura Keene, who is the star of the play, comes forward to try to quiet the crowd.
Presence of mind. Remain in your place. Order, gentlemen. Order.
Miss Keene, bring some
And
water.
somebody else yells, "The president needs water." She rushes to her dressing room, goes back into the presidential box with a pitcher of water. She's invited to hold Lincoln and cradle his head in her lap. Blood drips on her gown and on her cuff.
Laura Keene's cuff, still stained with Lincoln's blood, is one of the more macabre objects in the Smithsonian collection.
I mean, there's something so amazing about this simple object, this linen cuff. Why are people sort of capturing and saving these really horrific things? But here is just a piece of cloth that held the blood from Lincoln that she wanted to pass on and be sure that it was safely kept. It's all about trying to capture that moment in some tangible way.
Lincoln's head wound is creating pressure on his brain. To relieve it, Dr. Leal puts his finger inside the hole to break up the clot. Blood is everywhere.
There was a young Navy sailmaker who was one of the audience that night. We asked Major Rathbone as they came out of the box, is it serious? And Rathbone held out his hand, and Rathbone said, "That's his brains." Serious? Yes, it's serious. That's Lincoln's brains right there, on my hands.
Fearing that Lincoln won't survive the journey to the White House, the doctors move him to the Peterson boarding house across the street.
It's all completely ad-libbed at that point. Here is Lincoln, he's been shot. Where's the closest bed?
At 11 o'clock, Secretary of War Stanton arrives at the Peterson house. With Seward wounded and Vice President Johnson unaccounted for, Stanton, in effect, is the acting head of the nation.
It's clear, I think, from the moment Stanton sees Lincoln that the president is dying.
Cabinet members are showing up, the family comes and goes. Mary, who is in no shape at all, is sort of removed from her husband at that moment.
It was Stanton who said, "Get that woman out of here being the bedroom in which her husband was dying."
For her part, Mary will never be the same.
So to have those moments of incredible happiness, just when you think you're gonna be relieved of your sorrow, be snatched away again, pulls her over the edge, and it's certainly understandable.
While the president lies dying, the assassins flee. Booth makes it to Maryland and meets up with David Harold before the alarm is sounded. Powell left Seward's home, but failed to escape the city and was forced to hide. Stanton immediately begins the investigation.
When Lincoln was shot by Booth, that was bad enough, but the attack on Secretary of State Seward by Powell indicated this wasn't just one nut job. There are multiple people involved in this thing. Was this a last desperate gasp by the Confederacy to do by murder what they hadn't been able to do by battle?
All movement on the street stopped.
Stanton blocks roads, searches steamboats and trains, and offers a reward of $10,000.
Mr. Vice President.
Around 1:30 a.m., Vice President Johnson arrives, unharmed. George Atzerodt had lost his nerve.
The greatest tragedy in 19th century America was the success of Booth's plot to assassinate Lincoln.
The second greatest tragedy was arguably the failure of the administration that followed him. With the end of slavery, the future of America was at a monumental turning point.
The tragedy of Lincoln's death is not just that he was assassinated, but when he was assassinated, when he has promised freedom to enslaved people.
Instead of true freedom, Johnson offered economic slavery for African Americans by allowing former slave states to implement the Black Codes.
Under Lincoln, the North won the Civil War, and under Johnson, the resistant South won the subsequent peace.
Seward also survives. Though repeatedly stabbed, miraculously no arteries were severed, but his face is permanently scarred. Frederick Seward's skull was cracked in 2 places. He slept for 60 hours, but recovered. Through the night, Stanton interviews witnesses.
We looked up probably at them more than the play.
Almost from the first person that Stanton talks to in his investigation, people are telling him the assassin in Ford's Theater looked like or was John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth is a well-known figure. Imagine that a famous current actor murdered someone in a crowded theater in Washington. It would be pretty easy to say, look for famous current actor.
just feet away from Stanton's headquarters. Lincoln's long frame barely fits on the small bed. A month before the assassination, this room was rented by a young actor named Charles Warwick. In an ironic twist of history, a visiting friend fell asleep upon this same narrow bed. Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth. But Booth will never meet a soft bed again.
Booth was injured, and there's a controversy over when he was injured. When he jumped off the balcony after he had assassinated the president, he may have broken his leg then, or on their ride through southern Maryland, his horse stumbled and fell on top of him, and he may have broken his leg then. But getting through the countryside with a swelling leg, and he was very weak, was very difficult.
At 7:22 a.m., Lincoln takes his last breath. And Edwin Stanton famously eulogized,
Now he belongs to the ages.
though it offers only cold comfort. The race is on to bring the masterminds to justice.
We will follow him to the end of the earth, and we...
Stanton is certain he will find a link between John Wilkes Booth and Jefferson Davis.
Now we're sweeping.
Stanton was very keen to show that this was not merely a deranged actor and a couple of his Confederates, but was actually the Confederacy.
But a tie to the Confederacy was never found. And many Southerners felt Booth's crime crossed a line.
It's clear from his journal that he expected to be praised and that people would be excited and happy that he had done this. He was receiving Southern newspapers from some of the people that were helping him hide, and he was deeply wounded that he was not being celebrated as a hero.
A country groaned beneath this tyranny and prayed for this end. Yet now behold the cold hand they extend to me.
While Booth fled, Surratt, Powell, and Atzerodt were caught in Washington and sentenced to be hanged. Awaiting their fate in stifling jail cells, the prisoners were hooded to prevent them from communicating.
I think that they were quite convinced that their conspiracy and their plot to assassinate Lincoln would be successful and that they would not be caught.
You just look at this material and you can see the incredible vengeance, the hatred towards these conspirators, these prison hoods. We're driving them literally crazy.
There was a practical purpose, but I think underlying all of that really was an intent to make them as uncomfortable as possible. And it bordered on torture, certainly. I'm sure that they never imagined this.
Booth was never imprisoned.
Private, burn that barn!
The Union Army closes in. They've been following his trail for days and days and days, and they trap him in this barn.
Stand firm.
The troops set fire to the barn to smoke them out.
And Harold surrenders and comes out, but Booth won't surrender. And he has a rifle with him. One of the soldiers believes, as he's peering through the slats in the barn, that he sees Booth raise his gun to fire it. So he shot Booth instead. They pull Booth out and they lay him on the porch. And he dies there. But he dies there on the ground.
One of the things that makes the assassination difficult to accept is that one person who's not really that important in American life can bring down someone so important to everyone else. It seems almost out of proportion, right? That somebody can be killed by a nobody.
But Lincoln's legacy lives on.
He's one of these incredible figures. He's a creature from the American frontier. He is imbued with this notion of the American promise, before there was even such a defined sense of what the American promise is.
Lincoln's presidency is unique. It was fated to be uniquely significant historically. He was confronting something no president before him had confronted, a disintegrating union.
You know, the greatness of Lincoln and restoring the unity of the country, the humanity of Lincoln and freeing the slaves.
If these things had not happened in the 1860s during the war, then I wouldn't be here talking to you today.
That hard-won, inalienable right of freedom and a nation reborn. 150 years after he was struck down in a moment of triumph, Abraham Lincoln still inspires.